Hello friends, thank you for joining me. My name is Brittany, and today I'm going to be talking about the art history of KdF. I'll start with a brief introduction about me. So I am a historical European martial artist, and currently I have 11 years of experience. However, I also have a bachelor's degree in ancient and medieval history through the University of Calgary with a minor in art history. Art history was my original passion before sword fighting, so it is my extreme pleasure to be able to blend those two things and be able to present this to you today. So thank you so much for joining me. I'd also like to add that I am not a native German speaker, and I apologize in advance for my very Anglo pronunciations of these German words. Let's start by talking about what art history is and what it is not. It should be noted that art history is not art critique. We are not trying to determine the value of a piece of art or trying to determine whether it is good or bad. Instead, art history is used to place a piece of art within its context. This is done by analyzing things such as the artist, the techniques used to create the piece of art, or other impacts such as cultural, social, or political movements of the time that would have influenced the art and the artist. As a study, art history is very complementary to other studies, as we will soon see, such as the study of historical European martial arts, as well as the study of codicology. The study of historical European martial arts is heavily rooted in a deeper study of historical source materials such as fencing manuals. Many of these fencing manuals included images which are essential to how we decide to interpret certain motions and actions that we see in the fencing manuals that we use. Given the amount of visuals that are available in our historical source material, I've always been surprised that art history is not more popular within the HEMA community, especially when you consider the intersections between artists, patrons, and fencers in 15th and 16th century Germany, which is going to be my main focus of this talk. Now, before we launch into any art historical analysis of our fencing manuscripts, I do want to cover briefly what codicology is, because the way that codicology and art history work together is really important in our understanding of HEMA. Codicology is the study of manuscripts, and it is concerned with how manuscripts were created, as well as the context in which they were created. This obviously ends up being very complementary to art history. I'd like to draw your attention to the image here on the right-hand side. It is a 16th century copy of a Talhofer manuscript. So now we can approach this from the perspective of art history or codicology, and really blending the two seems to be the best method. We can look at this as an entire piece of art as the book itself, and perhaps we want to consider the materials that it was made from, how it was scribed, by whom. All of these things become very important, and we can also look at it from an art historical perspective, where instead of looking at the book as a whole piece of art, we can actually look at the images that are present within it on an individual basis. Now would be a really great time to point out the difference between a book and a manuscript. The word manuscript literally comes from manuscrito, or handwritten. These are copies of books or other manuscripts where they were written by hand, and they have unique variations that make them totally different from any other hand copy. So you can have manuscripts where the text is exactly the same, but there are little human errors or variations in color, in size, and this is what makes manuscripts very unique, and that is where the study of codicology comes in. Something that is a book, in the modern sense of the word, is something where it's been printed and you have exact copies that are made in like mass quantities again and again and again. So there is a difference between a manuscript and a book. When we are talking about a fencing manuscript, specifically this would be a single unique copy of a fencing manual, whereas if you have a book, like Joachim Meyer's Art of Combat, for example, that would be a book instead of a manuscript, as that was printed and it has multiple copies without any variation. So let's take a look at our first manuscript. This is the MS Thought from 1459. It is one of 4 extant Talhofer manuscripts. The MS Thought is one of my favorite historical manuscripts, and HEMA Bookshelf actually has a facsimile of this exact manuscript, which I was very fortunate to get a copy of. It has so many great images in it, and there is nothing better than being able to actually see these images on paper instead of having to look at them through a computer screen. The art in this manuscript looks really, really medieval. The aesthetic is very medieval, and the way that they've used perspective, you can see that all 4 figures in the image on the right are all existing on the exact same plane. There's not a whole lot of depth there. This is really common of earlier medieval art. What's really fascinating about this is that in the same time period of the 1450s, other areas of Europe, such as Italy, are moving away from this type of depth and perspective and using more realistic proportions and geometries. So at the time, the technology for art was there, we just don't see it showing up in this manuscript. This is also a heavily illustrated manuscript where nearly every page has some type of illustration. These would have been hand-drawn and hand-colored, so there is quite a bit of money that would have been put into this manuscript, especially considering the materials used for it. So while this might not have the same effect as really high-class Italian art, which I will show you an example of here in a moment, it certainly didn't lack expense, which is really important to note. The expense for this, as it puts it in context, right? The value of it, not necessarily of it being subjectively good or bad art, but the value that it would have had for its owners and anyone else who owned it thereafter. Now compare this to an Italian piece of art from the exact same decade, possibly even the same year. We have the Crucifixion by Andrea Mantegna, and there's some things to note here before we compare them, because it's not fair to compare the MS Thought to this piece of art directly, but looking here you can see the amount of just art technology that was available, the depth in it, the vibrancy of the colors, the geometry used, the proportions. It's all very sophisticated. However, we have to keep in mind that this piece of art is not a manuscript or part of a manuscript. Rather, this would have been an altarpiece in a cathedral. So this would have had a lot of eyes on it. It would have been the absolute, drawing in of everyone's attention. It was very important. God himself cared about how beautiful it was. So the amount of expense that would have gone into a altarpiece like this one is just completely incomparable to what would have gone into a personal manuscript. However, I did want to bring this forward just to note that in the 1450s, art was very sophisticated, even if it doesn't always look that way in every single piece. So art is constantly changing and evolving over time, and that's part of the art historical approach, is to understand how it changed and what influences were impacting art at the time and in certain regions. And certainly by this time period, the Italian schools of art were extremely advanced, very sophisticated, and the Northern Renaissance that had happened through the German region was not quite as ready to take hold of German art as it had already just dominated the Italian scenes. With that said, the Northern Renaissance was boiling just under the surface, especially in the 1450s, which is the decade that we are looking at with the MS Thought. This was a really important time, especially in the Holy Roman Empire, where the movable print or movable type printing was now a thing. So while the MS Thought is a handwritten piece of work, the printing press existed, so this was a deliberate choice to go with a handwritten option, a manuscript, instead of having a printed book that would be readily available for, many, many people to have access to. Obviously, this being believed to be a personal manuscript of Talhofer, that makes sense, instead of going with like a mass-produced book for people's consumption. So Gutenberg introduces movable type printing presses in Europe, and this ends up being revolutionary. It's referred to as the beginning of the print revolution. It has lasting impacts on the Reformation, on art. You see artists later like Albrecht Dürer really taking advantage of this in how their art is distributed, and it just triggers this avalanche of culture, which ends up really having its impacts in fencing manuals later on, as we will see a little bit later with Joachim Meyer, but I won't spoil that yet. I've also added an image here on the left. It is a page from one of the many Gutenberg Bibles. I say one of the many because Gutenberg had printed several Bibles using his movable type print, and this was one of the things that really helped push the print revolution forward. So as an extra aside, if you want something cool to look into, definitely recommend looking into Gutenberg Bibles. I've also been fortunate enough to see an actual page of one of the Gutenberg Bibles in person, and that was a really cool experience in my undergrad. So now we will leave the MS Thought behind and skip forward about 100 years, where we will look at Paulus Hector Mayer and his exciting projects. The influence that Paulus Hector Mayer has had on the modern study of historical European martial arts is undeniable, and we're very fortunate that we have 3 extant copies of manuscripts attributed to him, and we know a fair bit about those manuscripts, which we'll start to take a look at here in a moment. Before we start looking at those manuscripts, I'm just going to introduce Paulus Hector Mayer. Mayer was an avid collector of fencing manuals. He was living in Augsburg, and in 1579 he was hung for embezzlement. This becomes an important detail a little later on in this lecture. Mayer spent a great deal of money making his Opus Amplissimum de Arte Athletica. Mayer had hired local artist Jörg Bru the Younger to do all of the illustrations for these manuscripts. It has been suggested by Dr. Hans Peter Hills that the 2 figures in these manuscripts were Augsburg fencers who had modeled for Jörg Bru to do these images. He was the only source I could find for that suggestion or that claim, and unfortunately I couldn't find any primary source material to back that up. As an academic, I'm sure Dr. Hills did his research and cited and sourced it accurately, but I wanted to maybe suggest an alternative where there weren't any models at all. In fact, Paulus Hector Mayer being the avid collector of fencing manuals, I've always wondered if instead of having live models, if Jörg Bru would have just used references from other fencing manuscripts and manuals that Paulus Hector Mayer maybe provided him instead. There is evidence to suggest that that may have been the case, and I will touch on that momentarily. But first I'd like to compare the 3 extant manuscripts that we have currently. Without further ado, allow me to introduce you to the Dresden, which is here on the left. We have the 10825 here in the middle, and the 393 on the right. For this comparison, you'll notice that I have chosen 3 different pages. However, they are the exact same content. So the description and the position of the fencers, all of it is the same. I've done this on purpose so that we can have an easier visual to compare and contrast these 3 manuscripts. One thing that I'd like to point out is if we can recall the MS Thought Talhofer that I had shown earlier, you'll notice that the art has greatly evolved since then, and at this point in time the Northern Renaissance was well underway, very well established, and this is actually even after Albrecht Dürer's time, who is sort of the most notable figure of the Northern Renaissance. Depictions of the human form evolved over time in the art world. You have more anatomical correctness and realism and more dynamic movement in these figures as compared to earlier art. This is valuable for those of us modern HEMA practitioners when we are trying to interpret the source material for how our bodies should move when we're fencing. The more anatomically correct the visuals are, the easier it is to interpret, as compared to something like the 133, for example, where it's not always very clear about how the body should be moving when we're fencing. As you can see here, there's a little bit of weirdness going on with the fencer on the right with their arm. The other thing you'll notice is there's no shadows underneath the feet, and there's no way to definitively tell with this whether the right foot or the left foot is forward. Depending on how you want to look at it, you could interpret it either way. Now, of course, that's where the text that is accompanying the images ends up being helpful. A lot of times you will have the text saying whether you step with the left or the right or whichever foot is forward. However, if we just go off of the images, sometimes it's hard to tell. So, of course, this is on a source-by-source basis. Coming back to our Mayer manuscripts, I want to draw your attention now to the shadows under the feet. This technique was used artistically to show where something is in space, and it becomes very useful when we're trying to interpret historical European martial arts for obvious reasons. You can see the foot on the ground is the one with the shadow beneath it, and the foot lifted off the ground does not have a shadow under it. In all three images, there's also a horizon line that has been added by the artist. This is a technique that is used to add depth and perspective and to place the figures in space. Comparing that to the MS Thought and the MS 133 that we looked at previously, you'll notice that both of those manuscripts do not use those techniques at all. I'd like to draw your attention next to the script for these manuscripts. Part of the study of art history includes calligraphy and typography, which is looking at how letters are designed. It's possible that Jörg Bru was not only the illustrator, but also the scribe for these manuscripts. However, it is also possible that there was somebody else uncredited who was responsible for scribing these manuscripts. Regardless, let's look at the Dresden here on the left. This manuscript was written in German, and the calligraphy that was chosen was very deliberate. It is a very German-looking type of script. We can compare that to the 393 on the right here, which is in Latin. You'll notice that the script has now changed, and the calligraphy looks a lot more Romanesque. Now we'll compare that to the manuscript in the middle, which was written a little bit later than the Dresden and the 393, and it actually combined both German and Latin. You'll notice that they kept the script the same when using German or Latin text. Every detail in these manuscripts was very deliberate. Every choice was very deliberate. Mayer wanted to create his own fencing manuals that were on par with the ones he'd been collecting, and that meant spending a lot of money, and that meant hiring a professional artist who was willing to put in the time and the effort to have a lot of focus on the detail. So, let's talk about the artist. We've already determined that Jörg Bru the Younger was the artist for these manuscripts. He lived a relatively short life, and there's very little of his work that still survives today. Jörg Bru the Younger is so called because there is a Jörg Bru the Elder. The Elder is his father, and his father was a prolific and very well-known artist. Born in 1510, Jörg Bru the Younger apprenticed under his father in his father's workshop. The Bru family workshop specialized in educational manuals and illustrations for translations of classical literature. Jörg Bru the Elder had passed away, and the workshop was then inherited by Jörg Bru the Younger in 1534. Several years later, Paulus Hector Mayer would then approach him about illustrating his fencing manuals. The regional proximity of Mayer and Bru would have been a deciding factor in Mayer choosing him to illustrate these fencing manuals, and of course choosing a workshop that specialized in educational manuals and classical literature, something that Paulus Hector Mayer was a very big fan of. Now we know a little bit of history about our artist, and we can also maybe venture a guess why Paulus Hector Mayer would have chosen him to illustrate his works. The next question, then, is what inspired Jörg Bru when he was doing his illustrations? So bear with me while I do what I love to do, seem like a crazy person, and start making a bunch of wild connections. You can't talk about art history and fencing without talking about Albrecht Dürer. Many of Dürer's art pieces featured accurate depictions of arms and armor. For example, you can see the two small images below on the left. You have a Landsknecht on horseback, and then the very well-known and prolific Knight, Death, and the Devil. Aside from all of Dürer's amazing pieces of art, perhaps one of his most notable contributions for modern historical fencers is Albrecht Dürer's meditations on the handling of weapons. There are some theories about Albrecht Dürer actually being a fencer or being trained in fencing and wrestling. However, that's not really the point of my talk. What I want to do is introduce you to Albrecht Dürer's meditations because I believe that it directly influenced Jörg Bru in his illustrations of Paulus Hector Mayer's fencing manuscripts. The image in the circle on the right is a page from Jörg Bru's sketchbook. A few keywords had stood out to me here, including Ringen, Fechtbuch, Albrecht Dürer, 1512. I think it's no coincidence that Dürer's meditations on the handling of weapons was written in 1512. I think it's possible that this was a personal note for Jörg Bru to take note of Dürer's manuscript and to use it as inspiration for how he was going to draw his figures in Mayer's manuscripts. On the left and the right are Jörg Bru's illustration for Paulus Hector Mayer, and in the middle is a page from Albrecht Dürer's manuscript. I believe it is very likely that Jörg Bru would have used reference images from the fencing manuals of his predecessors as opposed to trying to use live models to try and capture dynamic poses such as these. Another influence on Jörg Bru would be that of Gregor Erhard, who was a Augsburg sculptor, and while he may or may not have actually been a fencer, he did have connections to the fencing community, and he had sketched a draft book that had eventually passed to Leinhard Solinger, who then sold it in 1560 to Paulus Hector Mayer. Perhaps it was through Paulus Hector Mayer's collection that Jörg Bru was able to access Erhard's manuscript and thus use it as influence, inspiration, or reference for his own sketches. For example, on the left you see Gregor Erhard's depiction of a throw in his sketchbook, and on the right, Jörg Bru's depiction in his draft book. I wouldn't even say this is inspiration, this is just a reference or a direct copy. In fact, you can see the details of the hair, the lines of the legs, and the placement of the hands being identical to Erhard's. It should be noted that references or copies in the art world like this were very common in sketchbooks and draft books, so this isn't a criticism or a critique of Jörg Bru as an artist. In fact, this is just to point out the references that he would have used while he was going to go about making his work for Paulus Hector Mayer. While I could probably do an entire 1-hour lecture just on the art history of Paulus Hector Mayer's works, this is supposed to be an exploration of 15th and 16th century German Fechtbücher. So I'm going to move on, and we're going to look at Joachim Mayer's Art of Combat. For modern historical fencers, Joachim Mayer's Art of Combat is likely the most popular fencing manual we have today. The Art of Combat was a book instead of a manuscript, meaning it was printed and more widely available and accessible. This would have allowed more copies to exist and survive up to the modern day, so we actually have more access to this than most other fencing manuals or manuscripts from an earlier time period. This, coupled with a modern English translation, has likely made it one of the most popular fencing manuals in HEMA today. And again, for something that is so popular in the community, so little is known about its art history. The Art of Combat had an early copyright note where the Holy Roman Emperor himself had given the privilege that this book would not be printed again in any form for 10 years following its publication. So while limiting the ability for it to be reprinted, it did, however, protect the rights of the owner. Although The Art of Combat is very popular, and the woodcuts within it are also extremely identifiable, the artist of those woodcuts usually gets overlooked. Tobias Stimmer was a Swiss artist who had relocated to Strasbourg. He's more frequently recognized for his work on the astronomical clock in Strasbourg, but in fact he did the woodcuts for Joachim Meyer's Art of Combat. Stimmer was a well-accomplished artist by the time The Art of Combat was being published. He was well known for his woodcuts, among other things, even so far as for Peter Paul Rubens to make comments about the quality of his art. So it's not surprising that he would have been hired on for a project such as this. Stimmer's woodcuts in The Art of Combat are set up in a way that is easy to understand. They're very practical and educational. Stimmer used techniques of geometry to enhance his art for the viewer. For example, you can see the grid work on the floor that might just look like tiles to some people, but what this actually does is creates a plane that we can utilize to determine where the fencers are in space. It helps us determine their footwork, their distance from one another, and other visual cues to help give depth to the image. We can compare this to the Talhofer manuscript we looked at earlier, which uses the horizon line very infrequently. Compare that to Mayer, where Jörg Breu adds a horizon line very commonly, and it changes our depth and perspective. We can see the evolution of using perspective, depth, and geometry through the fencing manuals that we have here. However, these techniques and artistic styles were not unique to Tobias Stimmer, nor were they unique to fencing manuals. In fact, these techniques are much older, as we can see it taking a strong foothold in the Italian Renaissance art of the 1400s. Stimmer also utilized composite images in order to create more than one narrative in a single frame. For example, you can see fencers or wrestlers in the foreground, and then as you go deeper into the background, you have other narratives being presented. Again, this is not revolutionary or unique to art of this period. We do see this in earlier Italian Renaissance art as well. However, for fencing manuals, this is not very common, as we had seen with the Talhofer and the Mayer manuscripts earlier, where they only used one image for one description or narrative. Utilizing composite or multiple narrative images means that the book required fewer illustrated pages overall. I like to think this was a deliberate choice and maybe a way to save on cost, as artists would have been very expensive, especially somebody as well-known and highly regarded as Tobias Stimmer. I had originally presented this lecture in a 1-hour format at SoCal Swordfight in February of 2022. I decided to cut down on a lot of details so that I could compress it into a 30-minute talk for YouTube. So now that we're nearing the 30-minute mark, this is where I will end. So if you ended up listening to this the whole way through, thank you so much. And a very special thank you to my patrons on Patreon. Your support is very much appreciated. Thank you.